Welcome to the Board Game Community Show, where we talk to people throughout the board game community, get to know them better. I'm your host, Riley Stock, and today I've got Mike Tanner.
Hey, Riley.
How you doing?
I'm awesome. How are you today?
I'm good. Excited to be recording.
Yeah.
Excited to have you on.
Oh, it's good to be here. I was really excited to get a chance to talk board game stuff with people.
Yeah. I'm not very active in the Tabletop Mentorship Discord.
Yeah.
But I see you on there every once in a while, and I'll see pictures of things you're working on or just comments on things you're working on. I'm like, that guy's a cool guy.
Well, I like that response to me. That's not a response I get all the time. At home, my wife and children are not typically telling me how awesome I am, although I often tell them how awesome I am. But it's nice to occasionally hear it from somebody else. So, yeah.
Yeah. Hey, well, you're welcome. I understand that. My wife's like, oh, gosh, this nerd. Why did I marry this?
My wife and I have such distinct, my wife described this week. I was teaching the kids a board game, and then I was teaching it to her afterwards. And I said something, and I was like, "Didn't you hear me just explain that rule though? Didn't we just go over it?" And she goes, "Oh, I hate listening to people explain how to play board games, so I just wasn't listening." And I was like, "This is good to know." 13 years into marriage and 21 years in our relationship, that anytime I've ever talked about board games, you have been off on a desert island somewhere listening to something else. So.
Will she play board games much with you?
Yeah, she likes board games. She's very competitive. So if she games that should be pretty casual, she is I will destroy you. There have been aggressive conversations in a game of Ticket to Ride.
Oh,
where
wow.
You're I mean, all I did was block that one little place, and I know that was kind of a jerk move, but got me 7 points, lost you 9 points. I feel and just, so she likes playing them, but it's often hard to get her started with a board game. She hates the learning of a board game. She hates the setup process, that sort of stuff. So if you can avoid all that, which honestly most of us also hate those things. So if you can avoid that and get her into the game, she actually really, really likes board games. So yeah.
My wife is the exact same way. Plus, I am terrible at explaining new games, so that only makes it worse for her.
We have a really good so I have a weekly board game night. We're lucky where we're at in Halifax, Nova Scotia, that we're pretty good right now in terms of being able to go around and see a few people. And so I've been able to have our physical board game night,
nice.
Which is awesome.
Yeah.
But we have one guy who introduces every game. He always says, "Welcome to Scythe, the game of this." And then he sort of goes through sort of the basic rules. And so it puts all of the mental labor, honestly, on him, and it's what he likes. So it's so much easier. And then I find when I have to explain a game, I'm like, wow, how do I explain a game to someone again?
Right.
So I'm just not used to it at board game night. We have that guy and he does that thing. And it's, yeah.
Well, kind of going with that, you're a game designer, hence being in the program.
I am a game designer, yes.
Have you play tested any of your games with people kind of outside of your family?
I've play tested them with my board game group, which is my family. Not my real family, but is more or less might as well be. Right. They're the people I call when I need help moving an appliance or anything like that. So they're close enough to family.
Nice.
I've done a little tiny bit of play testing, a little bit digitally, just some small stuff where I've sort of sent some stuff to people and had them go through it. And then I've just sent out one of my games out to a few local people. It's a simple deck builder, so it's something you could just send out a small pack and say, "Hey, here, go ahead and play it." And have just sent that out to some people who do not necessarily love me by necessity. So it'll be interesting to see what some of that feedback is. So yeah,
nice. I was wondering how explaining your own game feels. It's teaching your game.
Yeah, it is a really challenging thing because especially, I've played my own game 150 times by myself. I've gone over it over and over again to be like, okay, this works, this doesn't work. And so the first time you explain something, someone asks a question, you're like, how do you not know that? It's really hard to get out of your own head and like the curse of knowledge is really difficult to overcome. I've since learned from a few people, including my mentor through the tabletop mentor program, like give people as little as possible and see what they do with it.
Hmm.
I think there's a tendency to sort of be like, I want to explain everything so that you get this game right, and because I want you to be able to play it. And I think people skip over the learning to play this is going to be one of the big sticking points. So make sure that people can learn to play it without, like, you don't come in the box. So let's make sure we give people a way that they can learn it. So it's really been the way I've done it the last couple of times is, here are the rules. Let me know if you have any questions.
Oh,
And
nice.
yeah, it's difficult to see people struggle with it sometimes, because you're like, oh, you're wrong, and how do I how do I get you to be right without really putting my stamp on it? But yeah, it's definitely one of the bigger challenges, I think, in game design, is trying to get people to understand all the stuff that's in your brain and putting it out in the box or on the board.
Yeah, totally. I had a board game prototype convention that my mentor helped me get prepped for.
Mm-hmm.
And I told him, like, I am so scared to explain my game because I am famously bad at explaining things. And so he was like, just practice it. Like, we'll whittle down stuff and watch some videos on how other people did it. And I had to teach the game twice, two
Yeah.
sessions. And the first time I did okay, like it was shaky. I was nervous about more than just explaining the rules, the whole situation. But the second time I was like, dang, I nailed that. I did a good job explaining my game.
It's really rewarding to be able to do that. And it's funny, I find, like, my background is, I've got an education degree, I've been a trainer, I've been a presenter, I've done all those things,
Oh
and
wow.
I've and it still was a struggle to explain my game. Like, I think that it's difficult, I think, because, like, for example, the game I just taught my kids and my wife was Istanbul. It's a game I really, really like and I wanted to spend some time over lunch break playing. And I could explain that one pretty well, even though it's relatively complex, because in the end, I don't actually care if you like it or hate it. Like, I do, because I want to play it, but, like, it doesn't
Hmm.
matter to me. But I find there's that added component of, like, not only do I want you to be able to play this, but I'm trying to, like, convince you that it's great while I'm explaining it. Um, there's that sort of like, oh, and there's this fun part where you do this, and you're like, hopefully it's fun when you do that, because if it's not, this goes south. So yeah,
Yeah, like I'm invested in this and I really want this to work out. Like,
it,
how
it
do I get that to work?
yeah, it's actually been one of the good things about, there's a comedian I really like, Brent Morin, and he has this joke where he says, I was with my best friends, which means I was with my worst friends. And I've always, we kind of go with that line every week at game night, as we pick at each other and do all this kind of stuff. But it was interesting when I brought the game to my group, the most recent one that I brought to them, because they were really good about being like, look, we're not going to cut you any breaks on, like, that you're our friend and we love you. Like,
Yeah.
we're gonna tell you the stuff that we hate about this game. We're gonna try and break it. One of them literally just was like, I'm gonna try to break your game. And I was like, good. Also, that's so mean, but it's also very helpful.
Yes.
And so it's important, I think, getting people in the right mindset to test your game is as important as the testing itself. Like, I didn't. My mentor Jamie was incredible with helping me prep for my latest playtesting session, which was like, explain to people where you're at with the game, explain to people what you want from them and what you don't want from them. Because my group was very quick to be like, what if you did this and this and this? And I was like, cool, you can go make that game.
Right.
You tell me the problem and I'll try and fix it. But, like, that kind of stuff can be so common with people. Like, people just drill straight down to the mechanic instead of thinking about, well, why and how are the ways you could do this and the way you want to do it. And I think that was incredibly helpful this time around to come at it from that perspective, and it made a huge difference in the playtest.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense to me. And I think of things that usually people go for first is artwork.
Mm-hmm.
And they're like, you're like, no, this is a prototype. Like, none of this artwork is finalized. Like, this is just something I can change real quick. And I'm
And
not going to
that's
spend a lot of time on the artwork too much.
and
But
that's so hard because like I listen to a lot of board game podcasts, and like that's the feedback you get from most of the major designers out there, like people who have like a great history of this. They're like, look, don't spend money in the art, don't spend time on the art, don't do any of that stuff,
yeah,
like just get to it. And then you're like, yeah, but like I don't want to play a game that looks like garbage. So
exactly.
that has been right now, that's my biggest challenge, is like fumbling through a little bit of graphic design to get it to a point where it's not horrifically ugly, and enough that it's playable and that people, because for me that's a huge part of design. Like I think if you took a game like Scythe and took out like the graphic design and the artwork, it's like not nearly as good of a game. Um, and so why would I want to play that game without that stuff? Like it just really changes the dynamic. I think it's a huge struggle of like how do you get art in place without selling a kidney?
Yeah.
So
It's
yeah,
like watching an Iron Man movie where he's just wearing a cardboard costume.
100%. Like it's like you're just like, I mean, I get it. It's kind of like the movie. Like there's like overweight Spider-Man, old school thing where
Oh,
you're like,
yes.
yeah, I mean, he probably cost you less than Andrew Garfield or Tom, whatever his name is, and so this probably works out for you. But like, hard for me to invest in this story with that Spider-Man. So
Exactly.
yeah.
Well, what made you want to design games?
Whew. Right? I'm going to shy away from everyone's answer that I've ever heard, which is, well, I started playing Dungeons and Dragons. And then, so I did start with playing Dungeons and Dragons. But I started playing games more probably about 10 or 12 years ago. I played a lot of like real basic classics growing up. Like my family played a lot of Clue. My family played a lot of Monopoly. Like we played some Risk. High school, I played a lot of Risk. So I played sort of the really traditional ones, and then, like a lot of people, I kind of got into it when Settlers of Catan and Ticket to Ride really like hit really heavily on more generic pop culture stuff rather than in the board gaming industry.
Hmm.
And so I started playing them, and I thought they were great. I have different opinions of them now. Neither of those games do I really enjoy that much anymore, but I didn't realize how much there was and how much you could do. And when I started seeing other games with interesting mechanics and all these sorts of things, I thought these are fascinating. Like I just thought they were so cool. And then so I started playing with a group. We've been playing now for close to 10 years, and just really was involved with all these different games and just really started to think about them more, I don't know, cerebrally or whatever, where I just thought like, oh, you know what, this game would be really cool if it did this, and this game would be cool if it had this, or like this is the thing missing from this game. And so I started, not in a negative way, but I started poking holes at games I was playing a lot, and then just decided like, why don't you put your money where your mouth is and try and design something yourself? Like I enjoy that aspect of creativity. And I've always, I've written a lot. I had done a lot of like D&D writing before. And so for me, it was like, okay, games. And then I started and I was like, this is really hard. Like I thought it would be very, very easy, and it was not. I was really struck by the idea that it was way more complex than I thought it was. And I actually walked away from it for a while. I just thought like, look, I can't. I'll pick holes at stuff, but like I just can't design a game. And a few years ago, I was listening to an episode of Board Game Design Lab with Gabe Barrett, and Gabe said, designing a game is hard, so don't design a game. Instead, do one of these two things. He said, either take a game that works and build an expansion, or take a game that's sort of a classic and sort of reinvent it a little bit. So like take someone's hard work and like just build off of it rather than trying to start from scratch.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's what I did. I started with snakes and ladders and horseshoes and hand grenades, which was the first design that I did. Which was
Which is a spoof of Monopoly, right?
obviously it's a spoof of Monopoly. It adds a certain clue element, and there is some trouble that happens in it. But yeah, it was very much. It actually came from playing snakes and ladders with my son.
Is is it called? I thought it was Shoots and Ladders.
So this
Is that different?
depends. It's the same exact game, and so this is why it gets really funny for me. So growing up, I've seen it as snakes and ladders, and I've seen it as shoots and ladders. Neither of them make like shoots and ladders makes more sense because you're like right, like a shoot, like a slide
Yeah.
or a ladder. But growing up, all the versions I had were all snakes and ladders, which makes
Huh.
no sense because you just slide down a snake that is for some reason on a board, and then you climb up a ladder. And so I've always had this like, does the snake eat you? And then are you excrement? Like how does a snake like why am I on a snake? But the games I had growing up were all snakes and ladders rather than shoots and ladders.
Interesting.
And when I brought it to my game group, my best friends who were my worst friends, I brought it as shoots and ladders because it made more sense to me. And every my game group, there's this like ongoing joke of like, what's a shoot? And I'm like, well, it's like this. And then like everyone would just pick at it and pick at it. And finally I was like, you know what? It's snakes and ladders. I'm not doing this. And I like the way snakes and ladders sounds, even though it's less so. So yes, you are right in that shoots and ladders and snakes and ladders are the same game, and one of them makes sense, and the other one is the name that I chose.
But it works for yours because you've got snakes, ladders, horseshoes, hand grenades.
Horseshoes and hand
So
grenades. So I was playing a regular game of it with my son, and just realized like this isn't a game. Like I have no choices to make. So like I roll a dice and I move that exact number of spaces, and there's nothing that matters.
hmm
And so the first thing we actually did, and he thought this was really cool. My son was like 4, and he's always kind of been into game design as well. And so I said, well, what if you got to choose how many dice you rolled? So you can choose to roll one die if you're looking to get to like a ladder that's really nearby, or you can choose to roll 2 dice and move a little bit further. So he and I started playing it like that, and it was suddenly like, oh, this is like sort of a push your luck, like relatively fun, like just a simple change made it much better. And then I added a ton of chaos, which is you have cards that allow you to do various things throughout the game. And it's designed to be a really fast paced, hectic game, which is like not Snakes and Ladders. Snakes and Ladders is like, okay, sit here and try not to fall asleep while you roll a dice.
right.
But yeah, it just sort of grew from there. So that was the first game I designed. And then from there, I was able to start to think about games a little differently. And so that's sort of when I started really thinking like, oh, I could actually design a game.
You have another one called Loot that sounds really interesting to me.
Yeah, so Loot was something that it came from a much bigger design. So when you talk about, you'll hear a lot of people talk about game designers in terms of either are you a painter or are you a sculptor? So like, do you start
hmm
big and tear it down, or do you start from the beginning and sort of build it up? And I was walking with a friend of mine and our kids over the winter, because it's only about 6 months old at this point. And I was explaining this game I wanted to build, and like it couldn't be bigger. Like it was, well, what if you had a time traveling worker placement with a hexagonal board that's also a deck builder with hidden information? And I was at the time explaining to my son, like, he was overcomplicating a game of hide and seek with his friends. And so, right, you can see where this is going. So I'm like explaining, like, you always, you make too many rules. Like you try and complicate things. It's a fun game just as it is. And then you're adding all these things. And my friend Colin looked at me and said, tell me again about this game you're trying to design. And I was like, all right, No, that's fair. I do the same thing. And so I actually built it as is, like as I had described it. And I looked at it and said, there's actually only one fun thing in this, which is the deck building part that I designed. And so I decided, well, why don't I use some of those other ideas for other games and pare this down to the piece that's fun, which is, advice that I've seen a million times. Like, find the fun in your game and just invest heavily in that. So Loot became a dungeon crawling deck builder where you're fighting monsters, but it's a 2-player game. I also designed it thinking like, what if we just are stuck in our house with our significant other forever? What would be a good 2-player game that we could play?
Nice.
Yeah, just leaning into that pretty heavily. So the idea is it's a deck builder with an auction mechanic where you fight monsters, and your opponent has the ability to impact how strong the monster is or how strong you are, similar to like a Munchkin style.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a face-up draw row. And so at the end of each encounter, you secretly determine how much money you want to spend on getting your next card. And the winner gets to choose the first card and the loser gets to choose the second card. So and the point of the game is to have the most money when you're all done. So you're using the only resource that matters to try and get the cards that are going to give you the most of that resource. So there's these very crunchy decisions around like, do I give up 5 coins or 3 coins? How much is this going to really benefit me in the long run? What's the consequence of not getting it? So it's a small game in terms of, I think it sits right now at 84 cards or so. And but with a pretty heavy decisions, but also very fast. Like you're not going to spend a lot of time. It's a simple decision metric with not so many options, but was really designed to be like a fast-paced game, and it is tested really well so far. Like the thing I've been really proud of in both the games that I've worked on so far, and it matches with like my personal player psychographic, is they're fun. Like, I'm not a heavy Euro gamer usually. Like, long-term engine building and strategy has never been the reason I play games. I play games for like the big moments in a game. And both my games so far, the feedback has been like, this was fun. There were awesome moments. And so now it's just trying to take away everything that doesn't produce those moments.
I do the same thing. I'm a chiseler.
Mm-hmm.
Start with something big and chisel it down.
What do you find is the hardest thing for that? Like, how do you, because like I chisel away these mechanics, but I'm like, but I like that mechanic. So how do you deal with that?
It's some of it's player feedback when I get that, but even still, it's like when I'm designing the board and making the components, I do it all on Tabletop Simulator.
Yep.
Is this taking up too much space? Does this make the board look cluttered? I'll kind of go through that process and be like, okay, well, maybe I don't need this idea, or maybe I can simplify this and cut it into this process. And
that's the biggest thing I struggle with is I got for Christmas, I got this awesome kit that my wife got me called the White Box by Jeffrey Holcomb.
Yeah.
And so it's like, here's all the cubes and all the hexes and all the coins. And so it's really nice to get stuff like physically on the table. Cause I'm more of I'm just starting to learn TTS so I can start to get games on there.
Cool, exciting.
Which is very exciting because I want people to play it. I also have this real challenge in it, which is like, but I like to touch stuff. Like, I am such a physical gamer. Like, you can get away with giving me a game that either I don't necessarily love or I don't understand or I'm not very good at. But if it's really heavy in like the physical play experience, I love it. Like I bring up Scythe all the time. I think that Scythe is an incredibly well-designed game. I've never remotely come close to winning that game. Like, I'm terrible at it, but I'm like, ooh, and I move this here and I do this here and I've got this mech and I can add things here. And so like, I really love the physical aspects to it. So for me, having the white box and being able to just take out some cubes and some meeples and all that stuff and throw them on the table and start to move them around has been huge for letting me work through stuff. Because then as soon as I start to like touch things and move things, I go, oh, that doesn't work. Like that's not something I'm going to want to do. And it's wild. The other thing that I find crazy is as soon as people start to like, as soon as people touch something and it breaks and you go, how did I not figure out that that was going to break? Like,
Yeah.
and it's shocking. Like how not blowing my own horn, but tooting my own horn, but like you're thinking through all these things. And then it's like the smallest little thing just falls apart in a game. And you're like, well, I really wish you hadn't have done that because that was the game and now it's not. And it's, so I like moving stuff around and going, oh, well, when you do this, it breaks. And so for me, I do, I test it out a lot with myself with a lot of solo plays before I'll ever bring it to somebody else, basically.
TTS though, it's like you just have to add time, and yeah, you don't get the physical feel, but you do get to open up your audience and who gets to play test it.
Oh,
especially
it's
in today's
massive
world
for that. Yeah, well, that was when we first. So my group, when we first went into lockdown, my group decided, okay, we're going to do TTS, and it went poorly because my group we're friends, so like most of game night for us is like eat junk food and make fun of each other, and so like the games are like. We were joking the other day around like if we weren't playing games, we have a large group now. We have 7 people, which has become challenging over the last little while. Of like, well, what do we play?
Yeah, most games are 4.
Most games are 4. We've been using 6 with a player who sometimes sits out and runs the game for us. Same guy who likes to explain things, also likes to actually sort of be a game master. And so it's been fine that way, but one of the things we realized was like, we talked about this the other day, was like, look, if we couldn't play games anymore, let's just hang out. Like, so for us, TTS and using like Discord audio channels and stuff, it pulled away from the experience. And so it turned me off of TTS in that it didn't do the thing I wanted it to do, because what I wanted it to do was not go play games. I wanted it to hang out with my friends.
Yeah.
And I found for that platform, it just wasn't quite the same. And so it's taken me a while to get my head around the fact of like, oh, that's okay, because that's actually not what it's 100% for.
Yeah. When you're playtesting something, you don't want to be well, I mean, you do want to joke around a little bit,
but like
table talk, but
yeah, I just mostly like, for me, it was like, it's hard for us all to make fun of someone for something they did at the same time over a Discord audio channel.
Yeah.
Because it cuts. So it's like, yeah, that makes it more difficult. So for me, for a long time, I sort of disregarded TTS because it wasn't doing that thing. And then all of a sudden I was like, wait, okay, yeah, this is fine. So it's now, and now I'm realizing like, oh, there's like so much. Like I've had all these people through the mentorship and through Twitter and stuff like that who've been like, hey, I'd love to try your game. How do I do it? And I'm like, okay, so you get 2 shots of a vaccine, and then you fly to Canada and you meet me on my deck and we'll play. So it's just like the things that it lets you do. I'm all of a sudden like, oh, I was like a dummy for not picking up on this a little sooner. So yeah.
Well, and it's intimidating at first. I'm part of a board game designers guild here in Utah. Luckily, there's people who are just mind-blowingly great at all of the digital platforms, and so I just have to go on and be like, hey, I'm trying to do this, and somebody will be like, hey, yeah, hop on the audio channel and screen share and I'll walk you through it.
Yeah.
Like, oh, such a good resource.
Right. And I thought TTS would be so hard. Like looking at the end product, you think like, oh, so I have to have an engineering degray and a master's in computer science. And then you find out like, hey, have you ever used GIMP? Okay, well, there's your cards. Hey, have you ever clicked anything? All right, well, that's the game. It is fascinating. I mean, yes, there's much more you can do with it, and I've seen some amazing simulations on it versus some that are a little more basic. But like to get a game to the table in the same way that it would be for you to like cut it out on cardstock and throw it in front of your friends is like pretty easy. Like it's not it's not crazy difficult. And for me, there's the investment I have to make on the front end, but the iteration is so much easier. Because like with loot, it's like, okay, I made all these cards. Okay, well, you calculated them all wrong. Like once we started playing, I was like, oh, there's some significant changes I want to make to it. And then it's like, okay, so I got to redo all these cards, reprint all these cards, cut all these cards out again, bring them to my group. And it's like, well, on TTS, it's like, hey, I uploaded the new deck. We're good to go.
Yeah.
And so it's definitely an area where I've had to sort of say like, hey, that real quick part at the beginning that you're uncomfortable with, yeah, work through that because it's worth it on the other side. And that's like something with game design in general is like, yeah, that uncomfortable part, like get through that and start having fun doing it. And then it becomes a lot more enjoyable.
Exactly. And you even save money
Yeah.
because you don't have to print stuff out and get new
Oh,
things. If you need a new iteration of something, if you find out your whole game board is wrong at one part, you don't have to redo the whole thing.
well, that was the biggest thing. Like I was literally about to, so I don't like, I was not a, I was never a big Magic the Gathering player. And I bring that up because everyone I've talked to about how to make cards is like, well, just sleeve them all. Like, what's the problem? Like,
Yeah.
how? And I'm like, well, because I don't like that feel. Like, I really like the feel of cards, the way that they're made to be. And so for me, I was just in the midst of being like, all right, so I could order 1,000 blank cards and then rewrite them every time I want to do them, or I could order like 300 sleeves and print all this stuff out. And I have looked recently at like what some print and play options might look like as a bit of a design challenge for me. But when I look at what's possible with TTS, I'm like, yeah, just take the time to learn it. Like,
Yeah.
and that's the other thing is like, I didn't realize how open the board game design community would be to like helping everyone with everything. Like,
Right?
it's wild because like I've been involved in other communities that have like, not to suggest there aren't gatekeepers in the board game community, but especially
Mhm.
in the design community, I find there's more gatekeepers in the player community and in the playing community than there are in the design community. Because in the design community, I find like anyone, including some relatively big names, are like, oh sure, I'll help you with that. Like, why not? Like it's really interesting to see what a nice group it can be in general. So
Yeah. And I think that's because, in other businesses, industries, it's like you're a competitor. And so whatever you do might take away from what I do.
mm-hmm.
But here it's like, yeah, we're competitors, but whatever you do, I might want to play.
Yeah,
And I might love what you make. And it might be one of my new favorite board games at game night,
well
and so we all want to help each other.
that's the thing, and I think too there's this aspect of like when I learned that you couldn't like I had no idea about this. When I learned you couldn't like trademark a mechanic,
Yeah.
like that games were just like, oh, well just you could literally take everything that everyone does and make your own game with it. I was like, what? Like, what do you mean? I just didn't, I come from the work in, I'm a marketing director, communications director. And so like, I come from like product management and project management where it's like,
Yeah.
don't tell anyone what you're doing and make sure we lock it all down. And so to come into a community that's like, oh, do you want to take that thing I did in this game and just use it in your game? And you're like, what do you mean? It's just really wild to me.
Yeah. Like, how do I get the rights to that?
Right?
Oh,
Like
you just take it.
you just take it. You like that dice tower thing that happens in Wingspan? Cool. Build one of those. You're like, what?
Yeah.
What? Like, so it's a very it's just it's so wide open. Like it's really game design to me is like the ultimate open source community because it's you can't lock it down. It's open source.
Yeah.
And so that part has been really interesting. So when I've talked about like, oh, I wish I could, like I've had dozens of people where I've said, yeah, I haven't gotten a TTS because I don't know how to use it. I've had dozens of people that I don't know just be like, do you want me to show you how to get it on TTS? Like, I could do that. And you're like, okay, I guess. It's just really, it's been interesting that way.
With your mentor, how's that been going?
Really good. I've had to take, a little bit of time off of it right now, just because my real life, as you can imagine, as in many game designers, game design is not my full time everyday job.
Hmm.
So we've been really busy at work, so I've had to sort of tone down how much I can how much time I can spend working on it. But Jamie was really incredible in number one of saying, okay, well, I'm here, and let's continue to just poke and prod each other a little bit on some things that we can do in the meantime. um, and the mentorship, I mean, I can't get over the program in general. I can't get over how well organized it is, how inclusive it is, how I made the so my biggest thing, it's actually interesting with Jamie and I working together, is that I am a white male, and I specifically said, like, I don't I'd like to work with I live in a relatively white male community, and so I'd like to work with people who are of different gender, different ethnic background, like different experiences.
Hmm.
um, and Jamie's big thing was, like, he said, they said this on a podcast the other day, is that they just didn't really want to work with a white male. That was their only thing. They were like, as long as I don't work with a white male, that's fine. And then when we worked together, the whole idea was, well, that's from a safety perspective. They had really negative experiences, and they wanted to uh, support people in a really great way. And we worked really well on the idea that, I wanted to learn things like how to just be more conscious of pronouns, and how to be more conscious of experiences and things that people were comfortable with and weren't comfortable with, and why people liked the games they liked and didn't like the games. And so for me, the biggest advantage of the mentorship group was just to see the game design world through very different lenses. Because for me, it's like, well, I this is all set up for me to win, um, and that's great. But I want to know where spaces are in the community that I'm maybe not conscious of, or not making room for, or not being respectful of in some ways. And so the game design part of it has been really helpful, but so has the sort of getting to know people aspect has been one of my favorite parts of the whole program.
Yeah, it's an awesome community they've built there. Like, even beyond just your mentor,
Yeah.
there's so many people there that are willing to help, both mentors and just other like mentees, I guess.
Yeah, and the way that the tier systems sort of work, and who's a mentor and who's a mentee, and how it all works out, was really interesting to me, because you know it's really easy to fall into sort of imposter syndrome when it comes to game design.
Oh, yeah.
Like, are you a game designer? Well, I mean, nothing's published, so no. Or like, well, I only sold this many things, so maybe not. And there's all these areas where it's really easy to fall into those traps. And what I love, what 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 they said when they were on a podcast I was listening to, was like, you can be a mentor if there's something you know now that you wish you had have known before. Like, I love that description of what it means to be a mentor. Like, did you learn something at some point in your life? Cool, you're available to be a mentor. And it just evens the playing field in a lot of ways, where it makes people feel really comfortable with things they're working through. As Jamie and I were talking about things, there were things that I was really good at that they were like, "Hey, could you help me with that? Like, that's not something I'm great at." And so it became this really really great working relationship that way. And I think that only happens if you're really purposeful and really careful about designing a community that way. And I think they've done an incredible job of designing the community that way.
And I think the whole board game community is, especially like you mentioned with designers, that's kind of how it is. And if you don't fit in there, if you are not like open to other people, or friendly, or accepting of other people for who they are, you generally don't make it or don't last very long.
Yeah, and it's funny because there's so many areas of the world right now, societally, culturally, where like you can be a bad person and like just still make it. And
Yes.
I'm making that as a very vague, bad person generic reference. I'm not
Right.
but like you can do that. And I generally what I've found so far is that the board game community is not a community you can do that in. And we're seeing people who maybe were part of the community for a long time. We're seeing that start to change with some people, and having like repercussions for their actions, which I think we're seeing socially as well in many ways. But it just seems like there's so many places you can continue to thrive. But the board game design community has been like, yeah, I don't think we're going to let that happen. I think we're going to be an awesome community. And like, the only gatekeeping will be, are you mean and bad and not nice to humans? And if that's the case, yeah, there's a gate. But other than that, come on in.
Yeah.
And that part for me has been huge. I've got two small kids. My son's 9. My daughter's going to be 7 in a couple months. And that's the stuff I care about. Like, my son plays hockey. And for me, I'm like, hey, man, you can't skate great. So, like, you're going to struggle with being a great hockey player. But the stuff you're doing in the locker room that the coaches are telling me about and the stuff I'm seeing with your teammates, like, that's the stuff I actually care about. And, like, I was telling him this week, actually, like, if you could get just, like, a little bit better, you're going to make teams that you shouldn't make based on your skill because you're a good guy. And that's the stuff that I care about a lot of teaching them. And so for me, that's what I've loved about the community is just like, yeah, this is how it is. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I haven't been to many conventions in person, but the one I did go to, there was a game that I thought it looked amazing. I watched it played for a little while and I was really interested in it. And then I started talking to the designer and he was very dismissive, kind of my wife was there and he afterwards she was like, he's kind of rude. Like, you were genuinely interested in his game and asking him questions about it, and like he just did not want to give you the time of day. And I was like, yeah, it kind of made me less interested in his game. Like, I wanted to know when it was coming to Kickstarter, and I still don't know if it went to Kickstarter or
Right.
not, because like, or how it did, because he didn't want to give me the time of day.
Yeah. And I've found that's been, I just started the last, year or so, I've started backing some projects on Kickstarter. And sometimes it's been like, yeah, I paid the full price because I want the game. Sometimes
Mm-hmm.
it's just, I just threw a little money that way because I thought it was cool and I wanted to sort of boost it a little bit. But oftentimes it's actually been the people, like now that I'm a bigger part of the Twitter community, especially with board games, I go look for projects that the awesome people in my community are talking about them making. Like it's far more often now for me to be like, oh, this person I chatted with the other day is doing something. I'll go back that than it is for
Yeah.
me to go and be like, oh, there's a great playthrough video and there's a great this and there's a great that. So I'm going to go ahead and back it. That happens sometimes. If your game is awesome, I want it. But there's a lot of like, if you're awesome, I want your game. Like,
Exactly.
and yeah, it's really interesting because it's just so different than than so many other communities that way. Like it's yeah, it's just a really, yeah, I love it. I love it. Happy.
Yeah. At
Yeah.
that same convention, so my wife was kind of being like, is the board game community not a very nice community? And I was like, I don't know. This is our first convention.
Mm-hmm.
And then there was like a raffle and we won one of Tim Fowers' games.
Okay. Yeah.
And Tim Fowers was there. And so I was like, oh, I've never played this game. I'm excited to try it. I just went up to like meet him and tell him I was excited to play his game. And he was running a play test of Burgle Bros 2,
Yep.
and he just stopped and let them play, and he talked to me for like 5-10 minutes, and I was like just trying to talk to him, like, and just say like, hey, I'm excited to play your game, thanks so much for donating it, and all this stuff. And he just like genuinely had a conversation with me and talked to me, and I was like, this is awesome, this guy's rad. And then later I had no idea that he was a pretty big name in the board
Right.
game industry. And when I got home, I looked him up and I was like, oh my gosh, he does this game and this game. And oh, he's so revered, and he was so nice, and from there it kind of dominoed into seeing how many other people are just amazing in the whole community.
Well, this is, and when you meet great people, it's so awesome. Like I had a story. It's not board game related, but I work with a Christian ministry organization, and there's a local guy who won a Stanley Cup. He played for the Anaheim Ducks, won a Stanley Cup, and he lives like down the road from me, kind of thing. And I'd never met him, but I'd like followed his career. And he was at an event that we were hosting, and I got to meet him, and I wanted to know, like, what was it like to play with Teemu Selanne and Paul Kariya? And like, what was it like to live in California? And like, when you won a Stanley Cup, how was that? And he was like, I hear your son plays hockey. Like, yeah, my daughter plays hockey too. And we spent like 15 minutes talking about being hockey dads. So then I left the room and I went in another room, and my people I work with knew that I was like really, really excited to meet him. And so they said, "Oh, did he show you his ring?" And I was like, "No, I forgot all about it." Like and so he came in the room. They went to him and they were like, "Look, Mike really wants to see your ring." So he came and like let me wear it, and I have this picture of me wearing a Stanley Cup ring. And we've since hired him. He works with us now, but it was just amazing because I was like, "You're kind of not supposed to be as nice as you are."
Yeah.
Like I sort of just imagined that if you didn't want to be, you could just be whatever you want it to be. But it's interesting to me, like people who don't have to be that nice of a person when they are, like it sounds like you had that experience as well, is like, oh, like that's awesome. And I've just, in the board game community, I've seen that so many times with people who are like, I was at a conference, or I was at a convention, and somebody came up and they asked about my game. So I played with them, or I talked to them, or I gave them a copy, or I did this or whatever. And just seeing that from people, it's it's just a very inspiring thing to see.
Makes me excited for conventions to start up eventually.
I know, right? I've never been to one. There's no game convention per se where I live, or really that close.
Hmm.
I live on the east coast of Canada. It's a pretty small spot. Part of me has thought there's an okay board game community here. So part of me, given that I have a background in conference organizing, I was like, maybe I just go make it happen, which is something I've talked about recently. So,
Very
but
nice.
I love that stuff. Like I ran a conference for a long time called PodCamp, which they happen all over the place. But they're these unconferences. So basically, anyone can go give a talk about anything they want. It's like TED, but there's no like screening process. It's just, what do you want to talk about? It's usually digital or community oriented. Um, and so I've done that for a few times, and I've just sort of thought, like, the first talk I ever gave at it was how to use Dungeons and Dragons in community building. And so I'm like, well, maybe I just make the convention that I want. Be the change you want in the world. Well, be the convention you want in the world. So yeah.
Yeah. And there's actually does NunPub? I think NunPub might have like kind of a program where if you want to start a convention in your city or your area, they'll help you set it
Oh,
up.
nice. I'll have to check
Um,
it out. That's sort of what PodCamp did. Like you could sort of contact the overarching organization, and they'd be like, sure, here's how you do it, here's how you set it up, that kind of stuff. So it
oh, very nice.
might be cool to check out. I just really, it's been so interesting to me because getting to talk to people about, I get to play games with my kids, and like I say, my son is very interested in game design. Like me, he builds far too large of a system, and then it's just chaos. But I, aside from online, I don't necessarily have the space to like talk to people about game design or like board games and that sort of stuff. Like, it's just sort of like
Yeah.
play a game and then cool, you're done. And I've loved, being part of the Tabletop Mentorship Program, the communities I'm a part of on Discord now, and same on Twitter, getting to actually chat with people about, mechanics, which is such a nerdy, silly thing that if I went to my wife, like if my wife got home from work tonight and I was like, hey, just wanted to talk to you a little bit about worker placement, she would exit the house. Like she'd be like, yeah, I'm out. I'm not doing this. So getting to have those kind of cool conversations with people about something that they also think is cool is really has been really, really interesting. So
I'm glad I'm not alone in that. That my wife, like, she'll put up with me talking about it for a couple of minutes, but at a certain point, she's like, okay, like, let's move on to something else.
there's a chance that we're married to the same person, and she's just an amazing commuter.
Yeah.
Because like what she'll often say is like the mistake my wife will sometimes make is like leaving an opening. Like I'll mention
Hmm.
something about board game night, and she'll be like, "Oh yeah," and I take that as like now I can tell her everything. And like
Permission
shortly into
granted.
that conversation, she's like, "No, no, no, no. I was 100% humoring you. Um, I will listen to did you win, did you lose, maybe one detail. I am not listening to how you built your engine or how you messed somebody up or whatever." She's just like, no, no, we're not doing that.
I'm pretty sure we're married to the same person.
Yeah,
I'm
yeah,
convinced.
yeah. It's and it's been interesting. Like she, when she gets into a game, like she'll play it and she really, really enjoys it. But again, yeah, it's hard to like. I'll try any game that you throw at me. Um,
Same.
I'm just like, oh, it's a game that I don't like that style or theme or mechanics. Okay, let's play it. Like, let's just do it. And if I don't love it, I don't love it or whatever. But she's pretty. It takes a lot to convince her to try a game, but she loves board games. But it does take a lot to my son. I can just be like, hey man, I found a new game, and he's like, let's do this. Like he's
Nice.
all in, and it's been awesome because like they play games that are definitely like my daughter is 6. She beat me at Istanbul last week,
Ooh.
which I was like, I'm very angry at you for being 6 and beating me at this Euro, but like also that's pretty cool. And like they've played Dominion for years, Puerto Rico, um, Ticket to Ride and Catan. They actually also find kind of boring in the same ways that I do, which is probably because I lean into that pretty heavily. But yeah, it's been really interesting to see the games that they're interested in and what they like to play as well.
Those games like Catan and Ticket to Ride, they're great for what they are, and I think like I hold them very high in my mind because they're what got me into real
Exactly.
board games.
Yeah.
So I
They're
totally get that.
yeah, like they're games like I don't want to play a game of Catan and I don't want to play a game of Ticket to Ride. However, I wouldn't play Clank or Root or whatever if I hadn't have played Ticket to Ride and Catan and all
Exactly.
those things. So I think that I think also you have to give a certain amount of like credit to the beginners. Like Dominion, for example, is the first deck builder that did deck building the way
Oh
it did
yeah.
it. And so like yeah, I think there's games that are way more interesting that do deck building now, but like you have to give credit for the fact that these were the first people to do it. And so I think the same with Catan and the same with Ticket to Ride. We wouldn't have whole genres of games if they hadn't have done it in the first place. Um, I mean, it's funny. I just played Clue the other day we went to visit my mom and we played Clue. She has a new version, which is like weird, but
Hmm.
there's like an additional. It's real weird. You basically have the potential to be murdered while you're out looking for the murderer, um, and it's just done in a really random way. Like it's done in a really like it doesn't look like a lot of design thinking went into it. It just looked like they were like, how could we add something to Clue? Um, but
Oh.
we played it sort of the traditional way to play, and I thought like yeah, I don't find this game as interesting as I find most games now, but like imagine when this game came out. Like basically other than this, you were like, would you like to play cribbage? No. How about this only other game that we found? And so I think that there's
Yeah.
a certain, I think, reverence that should be held for the games that started it. And, I actually feel that way about Monopoly, despite the fact that I often hate it. We play it a lot during the summer at our cottage, and the kids really like it. And my wife basically will refuse to trade the entire game, uh, which ruins the game. And then if you eventually convince her to trade, she will lose, and she will be furious at you that she agreed to trade when she didn't want to trade. And so it spirals out of control pretty heavily. But yeah, I think, like, as cool as all the new games are and stuff like that too, I think that there's a certain place for, hey, if you've never played a game, maybe don't start with Terraforming Mars. Like,
Yeah.
maybe start with Clue or Risk, or, before you play Risk Legacy, probably play Risk.
I like to get to know people beyond board games. So, what do you do outside of board games? Like, what hobbies do you have outside of this?
Just board games? No. So outside of board games, I've regularly been a podcaster. I've had podcasts about business, pop culture, potato chips. I'm about to launch another podcast actually on board game design. Um, I I love sports, so avid. I play hockey. I just started playing a few, like, 10 years ago. So I'm not any better than my son, really, who is 9. Um, so play a lot of sports. And last year I got super into biking. So I started doing a lot of trail riding last year. So we have a cottage that's about an hour outside of the city, and so I would actually bike and sort of meet my family there. Um, and yeah, family life keeps me pretty busy. Um, so as I said, I've got 2 kids, and so we spend a lot of time adventuring. So we're sort of big outdoorsy. So every weekend right now is a hike or a walk or a visit to the park and that kind of stuff. And big movie buff. I'll watch any movie that ever comes out,
Oh, nice.
pretty much. And yeah, that's the stuff that sort of gets me going. I have a decent sized library. I have an English literature degree, which means you can either get another degree or build your own library. So I built my own library and got another degree. Um, but yeah, I like to spend as much time as I can relaxing as much as possible. With 2 relatively young kids, it can get pretty hectic. And so when I can sit with a cup of coffee and a book, um, that's as good as it gets for me in a lot of cases.
Nice.
Um,
What's a favorite movie and a favorite book?
so my favorite movie will tell you that I will watch just about anything.
Oh, no.
My all time favorite movie is actually Point Break.
Oh, okay.
The Keanu Reeves, Patrick Swayze, Lori Petty, Nick Nolte surf crime drama, which I really like. It's just such an exciting movie, I find, and since then I'll watch anything Keanu does.
Nice.
So Point Break is one of my favorites. I was also a huge Kevin Smith fan. I like a lot of really dialogue driven movies. So Mallrats, Chasing Amy, Clerks, all that kind of stuff was all stuff that I was very, very into. Book perspective, my 2 favorite books are, I'm actually going to name 3 because I can't make decisions very well, which
That's
is
all
why
right.
my games have 100,000 things before I start poking away at them. The Hobbit is a book I fell in love with growing up. It sort of inspired me to do a lot of reading and to get into fantasy and D&D and all those sorts of things. And then the other 2, one is a book called The Legend of Bagger Vance, which was also made into a film with Will
Mhm.
Smith and Matt Damon and Charlize Theron. But it's the Bhagavad Gita, so this religious text translated into the game of golf, and it's a really, really fascinating story. And then the other one is The Way of the Peaceful Warrior by Dan Millman, which is about an athlete who goes through sort of a transforming life experience. And I like sort of I guess new age ish kind of stuff. Like I find those stories really fascinating. Um, my my most people I know that read a lot, it's like, okay, I read romance or I read detective novels, and me, I'm like, I read something that I hopefully don't understand the first time I read it, and then try and figure it out from there. But yeah, that's sort of the stuff that I like to read.
So you're an intellectual.
I play one on TV. That's the character I play. I'm also just a big dumb football player who has had a history of concussions. So it's a whole bunch of stuff that way. But
is is football or soccer there?
American football, yeah, yeah.
Okay.
So I work with the ministry I work for is all over the world. So I work with people in the UK and Australia and Texas, and so I'm very careful now, usually, to say things like American football
Yeah.
rather than football, because people are like, "Oh, that's not football." But yeah, so played football all through high school. Yeah, I've always been really, really into sports, and so that's the stuff I like. Yeah.
Yeah, we got to know you like that's a lot of hobbies. That's a lot of stuff.
There's an amazing book that I read recently, and I don't have it here because I lent it to my neighbor, but it's called How to Be Everything by Emily, I want to say Wapnick, Wapnick, I think. And basically, she writes this book about what she calls multi-passionates, which are people who traditionally have been told, like, why can't you just pick something and stick to it? And so she's like, well, because that might not be how you're wired. And it's in this really interesting thing where I've been like, oh, that's why I like to write and do podcasts and do music and like board games and movies, because that's sort of what I'm into. So yes, a little bit of everything is sort of how I do things.
Well, let's wrap it up.
Sure.
What have you got to plug? Social media, website?
So reallylittlegames.com is my website. And so there's nothing coming out. Like I can't do the traditional like launching on Kickstarter on Thursday.
Yeah.
We've got this, the games, it really was just in January of this year that I said, okay, this is actually something I want to do more than just a hobby. It's something that I actually want to start putting out in the world. So my plan is that two of the games I've been working on for a while, my hope is late this year, early next year, I'll probably bring them to Kickstarter.
Perfect. Well, until next week, keep nerding out, everybody, and we'll get to know somebody again. I haven't come up with a sign off yet. I'm terrible at sign offs.
I liked my favorite part is that I really liked where it was going, and then you sort of like the voice trails off. You're like, that's
Yeah.
I think your sign off every week should be, I think it's maybe Board Game Design Bros that do it, where like their sign off every week, or maybe it's their sign in, is really like, it sounds like they are missing it, but it's like obvious on purpose.
Yeah.
I think it's their sign in where they're like, we're two brothers who also maybe. And so I actually really like the, I think you should keep this closing exactly as you had it, which was like, and see, yeah.
Bye. Please come back.
Please come back. I'll get better at this next week, I swear. Yeah. No, that was a lot of fun.
Thank you for listening to the Board Game Community Show. You can follow me on Twitter at NerdOutWithUs. And if there's guests or somebody you want to get to know better in the Board Game Community Show, or in the board game community, let me know. You can DM me or at me. Whatever is clever. And if you want to come on, you can also let me know. I would love to have you on. No matter how big, no matter how small, whether you have a project going on or not, I'm just happy to chat with people. Mike Tanner has launched his podcast, so you can find that most places that you listen to podcasts. And that is That's Barely a Game podcast. So go check it out. I listened to the first episode and it was great. It was, I think, very fun. He talks to people who are new designers. So not your big time designers, but people who are more growing in the industry typically. So definitely worth a listen. All right. Until next time, board games, board games, board games.